You made a mistake, you just don't know it yet. The cold metal tightened around her wrists with a quiet click that seemed louder than the rolling announcements echoing through Terminal B. And for a moment, everything slowed. The footsteps, the conversations, even the distant hum of jet engines waiting on the runway. As if the entire airport was holding its breath without realizing why. Because right there in the middle of one of the busiest terminals in Atlanta, surrounded by travelers dragging carry-ons and checking their watches, a woman stood still while two uniformed officers closed in around her like they had already decided who she was, and more importantly, who she wasn't. And if you had been standing there, just a few feet away, watching it unfold, you might have thought the same thing they did, that she didn't belong, that something about her presence disrupted the invisible order people rarely question, because bias doesn't need permission to speak. It just needs a moment, and Officer Daniel Brooks saw that moment the second his eyes landed on her. His jaw tightening, his posture shifting, his voice already carrying the weight of authority before he even spoke. "Ma'am, I need you to step aside," he said, not loud, not aggressive, but firm enough that people nearby began to turn, curious, cautious, already forming opinions they hadn't earned, and she didn't resist. She didn't argue. She didn't even ask why. She simply turned her head slightly, meeting his gaze with a calm that didn't match the situation. The kind of calm that unsettles people more than panic ever could, because panic is expected. Panic confirms the story they've already written in their minds. But calm forces them to question it. And Brooks didn't like that. Not one bit. So he doubled down, stepping closer, his hand already reaching for the cuffs as another officer moved to block her path, creating a small circle that quickly became the center of attention. Phones subtly lifting, whispers forming. "What did she do?" someone murmured. "She looks suspicious," another voice added. And just like that, the narrative was set, not by facts, not by evidence, but by assumption, the most dangerous kind of certainty. And still, she said nothing, her eyes scanning the terminal for just a second, not in fear, not in confusion, but in calculation, as if she was measuring something no one else could see. And when the cuffs finally clicked into place, the sound cut through the air like a signal, marking the moment where authority believed it had control, where power believed it had made the right call. But what no one around them understood, not the officers, not the crowd, not even the man recording from 10 feet away, was that this moment, this exact moment, wasn't the end of a situation. It was the beginning of something far bigger, something that had already been set in motion long before she ever stepped foot into that terminal. Because the woman standing there, composed, silent, and unshaken, wasn't just another traveler passing through security, and she wasn't just someone caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. And as Officer Brooks tightened his grip and began leading her forward, convinced he was in control, she finally spoke, her voice low, steady, almost effortless. "You might want to check your clearance level." And it wasn't a threat, it wasn't defiance, it was something far more dangerous. It was the truth, delivered without urgency, without emotion, like a quiet warning echoing through a space that wasn't ready to hear it. And somewhere beyond the crowd, beyond the noise, beyond the illusion of certainty, something had already begun to shift. The terminal did not stop moving. It never does. But something in the air had changed, subtle at first, like a shift in pressure before a storm. And as Officer Daniel Brooks guided Ava Reynolds past the security checkpoint, his grip firm but controlled, he could feel it without fully understanding it. The eyes lingering longer than usual, the whispers carrying a different tone, not just curiosity now, but uncertainty. Because there was something about her that did not match the situation. Something that refused to fit neatly into the narrative he had already decided was true, and that bothered him more than he would ever admit. So he tightened his posture, squared his shoulders, and kept walking, convincing himself that procedure was procedure, that he was doing exactly what he had been trained to do. And yet her words lingered in his mind like an echo he could not silence. "You might want to check your clearance level." Simple, calm, almost casual, but there was weight behind it. The kind of weight that does not come from confidence alone, but from certainty. And Brooks had learned over the years that certainty like that usually came from one of two places, arrogance or authority. And something about her told him it was not arrogance. But still, he pushed the thought aside, because questioning yourself in a moment like this could unravel everything. And he could not afford that. Not here, not in front of a crowd that was already watching him, judging him, measuring him by how firmly he held control. So he kept moving, leading her toward a quieter corridor just beyond the main terminal, where the noise softened and the crowd thinned, where situations like this were meant to be handled out of sight, out of mind. But even there, the silence did not feel empty. It felt charged, like something unseen was already in motion, and Ava felt it too. Not with fear, not with hesitation, but with awareness, the kind that comes from experience. From knowing how quickly a situation can shift when truth catches up to assumption. And she did not rush it. She did not interrupt it. She simply walked, her steps steady, her breathing even, her gaze forward, as if she had already seen how this would end and was just waiting for the moment everyone else caught up. And behind them, just at the edge of the corridor, a man in a dark suit paused mid-step, his eyes locking onto the scene with sudden focus, his hand instinctively reaching toward his earpiece, not in panic, but in recognition. Because some moments do not need explanation. They announce themselves, and this was one of them. And back in the corridor, Brooks stopped, turning slightly as he adjusted his radio, his voice low but controlled as he called in the situation, requesting verification, requesting support, because something did not sit right anymore. Not after what she said, not after the way she said it. And for the first time since the cuffs had clicked into place, there was a crack, small but real, in the certainty he had built around himself, and Ava noticed it, not with satisfaction, not with triumph, but with quiet understanding, because this was always how it began, not with chaos, not with confrontation, but with doubt. And once doubt enters, control starts to slip, and as the seconds stretched just a little longer than they should have, the sound of footsteps approached from behind, measured, deliberate, not hurried but undeniable. And before Brooks could turn fully, a voice cut through the corridor, sharp, clear, and impossible to ignore. "Officer, release her." Now, Officer Daniel Brooks did not move at first, not because he did not hear the voice, but because something in the tone of it forced a pause that his instincts could not immediately override. It was not loud, it was not aggressive, but it carried a level of authority that did not ask for attention. It commanded it, and slowly, almost reluctantly, he turned, his grip still firm but no longer as certain as it had been seconds ago. And standing at the end of the corridor was the man in the dark suit. Now closer, now unmistakable, his posture straight, his expression controlled, his eyes locked not on Ava, but on Brooks. And there was no confusion in that gaze, no hesitation, only recognition and expectation. The kind that suggested he already knew exactly what was happening and exactly how it was supposed to end. "I said release her," the man repeated, each word measured, deliberate, leaving no room for interpretation. And Brooks felt it then, that shift he had been trying to ignore, growing stronger, pressing against the certainty he had built, because this was no longer just a routine stop, no longer just a judgment call he could justify with protocol. This was something else. Something that had layers he had not seen when he made the decision to act. And for the first time, doubt was no longer a whisper, it was a presence, standing right in front of him, waiting, and still, training held him in place. Procedure gave him something to hold on to, so he straightened slightly, his voice steady but no longer as firm as before. "Sir, this is an active situation. I need you to step back." And the words sounded right. They followed the rules, but even as he said them, he could feel how thin they were becoming, how quickly they were losing weight in the face of something he did not yet understand. And the man in the suit did not argue. He did not raise his voice. He simply reached into his jacket and held up a badge, not flashing it dramatically, not forcing it forward, just holding it there long enough for Brooks to see, really see. And in that small moment, everything slowed again. The corridor, the air, even the distant announcements from the terminal seemed to fade into the background, because recognition is not always loud. Sometimes it is quiet, immediate, undeniable, and Brooks felt it hit him all at once. The design, the seal, the credentials that carried weight far beyond his own authority. And his grip loosened without him fully deciding to let it. A reflex triggered not by fear, but by understanding. And behind him, the second officer shifted slightly, sensing the change without fully knowing why, and Ava stood exactly as she had been, calm, composed, her expression unchanged, but now the silence around her felt different, no longer the silence of uncertainty, but the silence that comes just before truth is spoken out loud, and the man stepped closer, his voice lowering just enough that it no longer needed to travel far. "That is United States Marshal Ava Reynolds," he said. Not as a revelation meant to shock, but as a fact that should have already been known, and in that instant, the entire situation collapsed in on itself, not with noise, not with chaos, but with clarity, the kind that strips away assumption and leaves only reality behind. And Brooks felt it settle in, heavy, undeniable, because everything he had acted on, every decision, every judgment, had been built on something incomplete, something flawed, and now he was standing in the middle of the consequence of that, his authority no longer leading the moment, but reacting to it, and slowly, carefully, he stepped back, his hands moving with a new awareness as he reached for the cuffs, the same cuffs that had clicked into place with such certainty, now feeling heavier than they should have. And as they released, the sound was softer than before, almost quiet, but it carried more meaning than the first time, because this time, it was not about control, it was about correction, and Ava lowered her hands without urgency, without display, simply adjusting her sleeves as if the moment had already passed for her, as if she had never lost control of it to begin with. And when she finally looked at Brooks again, there was no anger there, no satisfaction, only something far more unsettling, understanding, the kind that does not need to be spoken to be felt. And in that corridor, with the noise of the airport slowly returning around them, one truth became impossible to ignore. He had not just misjudged a situation, he had misjudged the person who defined it. The corridor did not erupt into chaos. It did something far more unsettling. It went quiet, not the empty kind of quiet, but the kind that forces every person present to confront what just happened. And as Ava Reynolds adjusted the sleeve of her blazer with calm, deliberate movements, the balance of the moment had already shifted beyond recovery for Officer Daniel Brooks, because authority, once questioned in front of witnesses, does not return the same way. It fractures, subtly but permanently. And Brooks could feel it in the way his posture no longer carried the same weight, in the way his partner avoided meeting his eyes, in the way even the air seemed to press differently against his chest. And for a brief second, he considered speaking, offering an explanation, something procedural, something that could restore a sense of order, but the words never formed. Because explanations only work when the foundation beneath them is still intact, and his was not. And Ava, without raising her voice, without making a scene, simply turned her attention to the man in the suit, giving a small nod that spoke of recognition, of coordination, of something that had been in motion long before this moment, and the man responded just as quietly, stepping slightly to the side, creating space not for escape, but for transition, as if the scene itself was moving from one phase to another, and Brooks watched it happen in real time. The shift from control to oversight, from assumption to accountability, and it was not loud, it was not dramatic, but it was absolute. And then Ava finally spoke again, her voice even, steady, carrying just enough to reach both officers without drawing unnecessary attention from the terminal beyond. "Officer, do you understand what just happened here?" she asked, not as an accusation, not as a challenge, but as a question that carried weight, the kind that demands more than a surface answer. And Brooks opened his mouth, then closed it again, because the truth was forming faster than he could organize it into something safe, something defensible. And in that hesitation, the answer was already clear, and Ava did not press him. She did not need to, because moments like this are not about forcing realization. They are about allowing it to arrive on its own. And when it does, it stays. And she continued, her tone unchanged. "You made a decision based on what you thought you saw, not what you verified." And there was no anger in her words, only clarity, the kind that strips away emotion and leaves only fact behind. And somewhere behind them, footsteps approached again, more this time, measured, coordinated, and when Brooks glanced over his shoulder, he saw them, additional personnel, not rushing, not reacting, but arriving with purpose. And that was when the final piece settled into place, because this was no longer a contained situation. It was now part of something larger, something documented, something that would not disappear once the moment passed. And Ava stepped forward slightly, not to intimidate, not to dominate, but to reclaim the space that had been taken from her minutes earlier, and as she did, the entire corridor seemed to realign around her presence, not because she demanded it, but because it was now understood, and she looked directly at Brooks, her gaze steady, unwavering, and said, "This is not about embarrassment, and it is not about punishment. It is about responsibility." And the words landed heavier than any raised voice could have, because they left no room for deflection, no space to hide behind procedure, and Brooks felt it, not as pressure from her, but as something internal, something that had been triggered the moment he realized he had been wrong. And for the first time since the situation began, he lowered his gaze slightly, not in defeat, but in recognition, and Ava saw it, acknowledged it without comment, and turned slightly toward the arriving officials, her focus already shifting forward, already moving beyond the moment that had just redefined everything for everyone involved. And as the distant sounds of the airport fully returned, the announcements, the rolling suitcases, the conversations resuming as if nothing had happened, one thing remained unmistakably clear in that corridor. Control had never belonged to the one who acted first. It belonged to the one who understood the truth all along. The corridor no longer belonged to uncertainty. It belonged to process. And as the additional officials stepped into place with quiet precision, the energy shifted from tension to structure, from reaction to control, but not the kind of control Officer Daniel Brooks had tried to assert earlier. This was a different kind, measured, documented, and irreversible, and Brooks could feel it settling around him like a weight he could not step out from under, because moments like this do not end when the cuffs come off. They begin, and Ava Reynolds understood that better than anyone in that space, which is why she did not raise her voice, did not escalate, did not seek attention from the growing number of eyes just beyond the corridor. Instead, she turned slightly toward one of the arriving officials, a senior supervisor whose presence alone signaled that this situation had already reached beyond routine handling. And with a calm that never wavered, she spoke. "I will need this interaction logged in full, including body camera footage and initial dispatch notes." Her tone even, procedural, leaving no room for interpretation. And the supervisor nodded immediately, already aware that this was no longer optional, because when authority meets accountability, documentation becomes inevitable. And behind them, Brooks stood still, his hands now empty, his posture no longer rigid but not relaxed either, caught somewhere in between as the realization continued to unfold, not all at once, but in layers, each one more difficult to ignore than the last. And he replayed it in his mind, the initial glance, the assumption, the decision to act without verification, each step feeling smaller now, less justified, as if the certainty he had relied on had been built on something far more fragile than he had believed. And beside him, his partner shifted again, this time stepping slightly back, creating a subtle distance that had not been there before, not out of disloyalty, but out of instinct, because when a situation changes this dramatically, proximity becomes a choice. And not everyone chooses to stand as close as they did before, and Ava noticed all of it without appearing to, her awareness extending beyond the immediate conversation, beyond the corridor, taking in the full scope of what this moment represented, not just for her, but for everyone involved. And she turned back to Brooks one final time, not to confront him, not to linger, but to close the space between action and consequence with clarity. "This is why verification matters," she said quietly, her voice steady, grounded. "Because once a decision is made in public, it does not stay private." And the words settled into the silence with a weight that did not need emphasis, because everyone present understood what she meant, the phones that had been raised, the witnesses who had watched, the narrative that had already begun forming before the truth had a chance to enter the room. And now, that truth was here, undeniable, documented, and moving forward whether anyone was ready for it or not. And Brooks felt it fully then, not as pressure from her, but as a shift within himself, a recognition that this was not just a mistake to be corrected, it was a moment to be accounted for. And for the first time, he spoke without trying to defend it, without trying to reshape it, his voice quieter than before, but clearer. "I understand," he said. And it was not a statement of compliance, it was a statement of realization, and Ava gave a small nod, not approving, not dismissive, simply acknowledging that the moment had reached its necessary conclusion, and with that, she turned away, stepping forward into the flow of movement that had resumed just beyond the corridor, her presence no longer questioned, no longer contained, but fully restored to where it had always belonged. And as she walked, the system around her continued to move, officials coordinating, reports being initiated, conversations shifting from speculation to fact, and behind her, Brooks remained where he was for just a second longer, standing at the exact point where his certainty had first been challenged, now seeing it clearly for what it was, not authority, not control, but assumption, and in that realization, something changed, not loudly, not visibly, but deeply enough that it would not be forgotten, because in the end, the moment was never about who had the badge first, it was about who understood what that badge truly meant. The terminal moved on, as it always does, but not everything resets when the crowd disperses, not everything disappears with the sound of rolling luggage and boarding calls echoing through the gates, because some moments stay, not in the space, but in the people who experience them. And as Ava Reynolds stepped back into the open flow of Terminal B, her pace unhurried, her posture unchanged, she did not look back. Not because she was unaware of what she left behind, but because she understood something most people never fully grasp, that true authority does not need to revisit the moment it has already resolved. It moves forward, steady, composed, leaving the weight of that moment to settle where it belongs. And behind her, just beyond the corridor, the system she had quietly activated was already unfolding with precision, supervisors speaking in low, controlled tones, radios transmitting updates, names being noted, times being recorded, because accountability, once triggered, does not rely on emotion, it relies on process, and process does not forget, and Officer Daniel Brooks stood at the edge of it, no longer at the center, no longer directing the situation, but now part of it in a way he had never intended, and the difference was clear, not in anything dramatic, but in the absence of control he had once held so tightly, because control, when based on assumption, is temporary, and what replaces it is something far more difficult to navigate, reflection. And as he watched the officials move past him, as he heard fragments of conversation shift from uncertainty to documentation, he began to understand that this was not a moment he could simply walk away from. It would follow him, not as punishment, but as a reference point, a line drawn between what he believed he knew and what he failed to confirm, and that line would matter, in reports, in reviews, in conversations that would happen long after this corridor returned to normal, and for the first time in a long time, Brooks was not thinking about procedure, he was thinking about perception, about how quickly it had shaped his decision, about how confidently he had acted on something he had not verified, and that realization did not come with noise. It came quietly, settling in deeper than any external consequence could have, and across the terminal, Ava reached the main concourse, where sunlight filtered through the tall glass windows, casting long reflections across the polished floor. And for a brief moment, she paused, not because she needed to, but because she always did, a habit formed not from hesitation, but from awareness, taking in the space, the movement, the rhythm of people passing by without knowing how close they had been to witnessing something far more significant than they realized. And she adjusted the strap of her bag, her expression calm, focused, already shifting toward what came next, because for her, this was not the story. It was just one moment within it, one interaction in a larger system she had spent years navigating, understanding, and at times, correcting, and as she resumed walking, her phone vibrated softly. A single notification, short, precise, confirming what she already knew, that the situation had been logged, that the process had begun, that the truth had been secured where it needed to be, and she did not need to read further, because clarity does not require repetition. And back in the corridor, Brooks finally stepped forward, not following her, not chasing the moment, but moving out of the space where everything had shifted, his steps slower now, more deliberate, as if each one carried a weight that had not been there before, and his partner fell in beside him without speaking, because some moments do not require conversation, they require understanding. And as they walked back toward the terminal, blending once again into the flow of uniforms and travelers, one thing remained clear, even if it was not spoken out loud. Authority is not proven in the moment you act. It is revealed in the moment you are wrong, and what you do next defines everything that follows. The airport had already moved on, but the system had not, because while passengers checked their boarding passes and lined up at gate 22, somewhere behind the scenes, the moment that had unfolded minutes earlier was being reviewed, replayed, and examined with a level of detail that did not rely on memory or interpretation, and inside a secured operations office, just a short walk from the terminal floor. Screens flickered with recorded footage, timestamps, and synchronized audio, capturing every angle, every word, every decision exactly as it happened, and Ava Reynolds stood just inside the doorway, her presence quiet but undeniable, not overseeing with intensity, not hovering with authority, but simply observing, because she did not need to control the process, she trusted it, and that trust came from years of understanding how truth, when documented properly, does not need to be defended. It reveals itself, and across the room, supervisors leaned in toward the monitors, their expressions focused, their conversations low and precise, pointing out sequences, noting inconsistencies, identifying the exact moment where assumption overtook verification. And there it was, clear as daylight, the initial approach, the body language, the decision. Made before a question was fully asked, and no one in that room needed to raise their voice or assign blame, because the footage spoke with a clarity that removed opinion entirely. And in another part of the building, Officer Daniel Brooks sat at a desk that felt unfamiliar, even though it was in the same facility he had worked in for years, because context changes space, and space changes perspective. And across from him sat a senior internal reviewer, not hostile, not accusatory, but composed, professional, and direct, holding a tablet that displayed the same footage now under examination. And for the first time, Brooks was not seeing the moment from within it. He was seeing it from outside, frame by frame, decision by decision, and it felt different, not because the actions had changed, but because the perspective had, and the reviewer spoke calmly, not as a judge, but as someone guiding a process that had already begun. "Walk me through your reasoning at this point," he said, pausing the footage just as Brooks stepped forward in the terminal, and Brooks leaned slightly forward, his hands resting on the edge of the desk, eyes fixed on the screen, searching for the certainty he had felt earlier, but it was not there anymore, not in the same way, because certainty without confirmation looks different when replayed. It looks thinner, less grounded, more exposed, and he took a breath, slower than usual, more deliberate, and answered, not with confidence, but with honesty, because that was all that remained. "I thought I identified a potential threat," he said, and the words were accurate, but now they felt incomplete, and the reviewer nodded, not dismissing, not affirming, simply continuing. "And what verification did you complete before acting?" And there it was, the question that had been present from the beginning but never fully asked, and Brooks did not rush to answer this time. He let the silence sit, because he understood now that rushing was part of what led him here, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried something new, something quieter but stronger. "Not enough," he said, and in that moment, the process shifted, not externally, but internally, because acknowledgement is where accountability begins. And back in the operations room, Ava watched the final segment of the footage, the moment the cuffs were removed, the shift in posture, the subtle change in tone, and she did not focus on the mistake. She focused on the response, because that is where the real story always is, not in what went wrong, but in what happens after it is recognized. And as she turned away from the screens, preparing to step out of the room, one of the supervisors approached her briefly, offering a short, professional nod. "Everything is being handled," he said, and she returned the nod just as simply, because that was never in question. And as she stepped back into the hallway, the sound of the airport returning in the distance, one truth remained steady, unshaken by noise or movement. Justice is not loud. It does not rush. It does not react. It observes, it records, and when the time comes, it speaks with a clarity that no one can ignore. By the time the review process moved beyond the initial footage, the moment had already taken on a different weight, no longer confined to a single decision in a crowded terminal, but now part of a larger pattern that systems are designed to recognize, analyze, and correct. And inside the quiet structure of the operations division, each detail was being placed exactly where it belonged, not to amplify the mistake, but to understand it fully, because understanding is what prevents repetition. And across from the reviewer, Officer Daniel Brooks sat with a stillness that was new to him, not the controlled stillness of command, but the reflective kind that comes when there is nothing left to defend, only something to learn from. And the screen in front of him shifted to another angle, another perspective, showing the same moment from a different camera, capturing the surrounding crowd, the subtle reactions. The phones raised just enough to record without drawing attention, and Brooks watched it closely, not to justify what he had done, but to see what others had seen, and that perspective changed everything. Because from the outside, the moment looked different, less certain, less grounded, more like a decision made too quickly in a space that demanded patience. And the reviewer paused the footage again, not immediately asking a question this time, allowing the silence to stretch just long enough for the realization to settle deeper. And when he finally spoke, his voice carried the same calm precision as before. What would you do differently now? And the question was simple, but it reached further than anything that had been asked so far, because it was not about the past. It was about the future, and Brooks did not hesitate this time, not because the answer was easy, but because it was clear. I would slow down, he said, his voice steady, grounded in something that had not been there before. I would verify before acting, not after. And the reviewer gave a slight nod, not as approval, but as acknowledgement that the process had reached the point it was designed for, where correction becomes intention, and intention becomes change. And elsewhere in the building, Ava Reynolds stepped out into the daylight just beyond the terminal doors, the warmth of the afternoon sun contrasting with the controlled environment she had just left behind. And for a brief moment, she paused again, not out of necessity, but out of habit, taking in the open space, the steady movement of vehicles pulling up to the curb, the rhythm of departures and arrivals continuing without interruption. Because the world does not stop for moments like the one that had just unfolded. It absorbs them, integrates them, and moves forward. And Ava understood that better than anyone, which is why she did not carry the weight of the moment with her. She did not replay it, did not dwell on it, because her role was never to hold on to what had happened. It was to ensure that what happened was seen clearly, documented properly, and understood correctly. And as she reached into her bag and retrieved her phone, a second message appeared, brief, direct, confirming that the review process had moved to the next stage, that recommendations would follow, that the system had done exactly what it was built to do. And she allowed herself a small, almost imperceptible nod, not of satisfaction, but of completion, because closure, in her world, does not come from emotion. It comes from resolution. And back inside, Brooks stood from his chair as the session concluded, not rushed, not dismissed, but guided toward the next step. And as he stepped out into the hallway, the same hallway he had walked through countless times before, it felt different now, not because it had changed, but because he had. And the difference was not visible to anyone passing by, not in his uniform, not in his posture. But it was there, in the way he moved, in the way he thought, in the way he would approach the next situation that required judgment, because the lesson had settled in, not as a consequence imposed from the outside, but as a standard rebuilt from within. And as the sounds of the airport carried through the walls once again, blending routine with reality, one truth remained steady beneath it all: the power to act is given, but the responsibility to act correctly is earned. And once that line is crossed, it is not the system that defines what comes next, it is the choice to learn from it. The airport continued its rhythm as if nothing had happened, flights boarding, announcements echoing overhead, travelers checking their watches and moving toward gates with quiet urgency. And somewhere within that constant motion, two paths moved forward in very different ways, one visible, one internal. And Ava Reynolds walked with the same steady pace she had carried from the beginning, her presence blending into the flow not because it diminished, but because it never needed to stand out to matter. And as she approached the exit doors, the sunlight stretched across the floor in long golden lines, reflecting against polished surfaces, creating a moment of stillness within motion. And she stepped through without hesitation, the outside air warmer, lighter, carrying none of the tension that had existed just minutes before. And she paused briefly near the curb where black sedans lined up in quiet order, her eyes scanning the environment not out of concern, but out of habit, awareness, shaped by years of experience. And her phone remained silent now. No new updates, no further confirmations needed, because everything that required attention had already been set in motion, and that was enough, because she understood something that most people spend years trying to learn, that justice is not about confrontation, it is about correction, not about proving power, but about restoring balance. And she moved forward, stepping into the next moment without carrying the last one with her, because her role was never to hold on to what had happened, but to ensure that what happened mattered. And back inside, Officer Daniel Brooks stood near the same terminal floor where everything had begun, the noise of the airport returning around him. But now it sounded different, not louder, not quieter, just clearer, because perception had shifted, and he watched the crowd for a moment, not scanning for threats, not reacting to movement, but observing, really observing, the way people moved, the way assumptions could form in seconds, the way a single decision could ripple outward before truth had time to catch up. And he took a slow breath, grounding himself in that awareness, not as a burden, but as a responsibility. Because what he had experienced was not just a mistake, it was a moment of clarity, one that could either be dismissed or carried forward. And for the first time, the choice felt deliberate, and as another passenger walked past him, he did not act immediately. He watched, he assessed, he verified, allowing the process to guide the decision instead of the assumption. And it was a small change, almost invisible to anyone else. But it was there, and it mattered, and somewhere beyond the terminal, beyond the glass walls and the constant movement, Ava entered the waiting vehicle, the door closing softly behind her. And as the car pulled away from the curb, the airport faded into the background. Just another location, just another moment completed, and neither of them spoke about what had happened, not because it was unimportant, but because its impact did not need to be repeated to remain real. And as the distance grew between them, one truth settled quietly into both of their paths. He thought authority came from the badge he wore, but that day, he learned that authority begins with the choices you make when no one is stopping you. And she never needed to prove who she was, because the truth had already done that for her.